No, that's a good one because, and that goes back to how important this essential understanding is, not just for students but for teachers. I've used this curriculum in my work with law enforcement on cultural competency, as they call it, or I mean, there's a lot of words for teaching culture to another group of people, right? And so I've used this in my sessions, and nuances, behaviors, history, protocols. So when you're working with tribal people in business and law enforcement, healthcare. We worked with hospitals, on just the basics of how some of the nuances and history and thinking and so forth and the differences and the similarities of we as Native American people. But so again, this is much bigger than that. But what's contemporary, I think, is much needed. I mean, and maybe it took a pipeline and a movement to re-energize treaties and rights and so forth, but that energy needs to continue, not only back home, but here and across America. But it has to be done in a very, very proactive way. I think there's always a time and place for a protest and a march and so forth, but if you're not talking to the powers that be, who have the power to change legislation, to enact legislation, or to fund something, then really where are your efforts going? Or if you're just using technology and social media just to blog about it, to write about it, to Facebook about it, and everything's up in the cloud, it's like, great, that's great that you have a lot of followings and people are liking it, but are you winning? Are you sitting down at the tables and talking about a curriculum? And that's why this is such a big thing, because it took time to convince people that, well, what do you mean? We're gonna do what? Rewrite history? We're gonna teach what? Yeah, but we did it in a good way. Because I always think about what you're trying to change here. To me, this is sacred. When you're talking about our history, our treaties, sometimes our customs, those are really sacred things. And when you talk about them, you have to talk about them in a good way. Because if you don't, 9 out of 10 times it's not going to happen. And that was taught by my father, and to do these things in a good way. And it takes those 7 virtues, that we taught. You got to have patience. You got to have courage. You got to have fortitude. You got to have bravery. You got to have prayer. You got to have forgiveness. You got to have love to make these things work. And when you do that, chances are you're going to succeed. Here's an example of that. But when you have an emotion behind that and you're mad about something, and probably aside from this, probably one of the biggest policies that we changed here locally was wearing the eagle feather and plume. If you look at that picture, this picture right here, that's a big deal to me. I mean, maybe to some people it was like, whatever. But every year during graduation, families would call the office and call Lucy's office and say, hey, how come the school doesn't allow my child to wear their eagle feather or their plume for the women, for the girls? And I got it. I said, yeah, well, let's talk about that. So we sat down and brought elders in and brought people, veterans in, who have the right to keep eagle feathers and to have the right to give eagle feathers out. They have that right. I don't have that right. Never given that right. And we educated the principals, the superintendents about here's what this means to us. And that was the first step. We didn't talk about, you need to, we didn't portray. Why? Because think about what we're talking about here. We're talking about an eagle feather here, something that's very, very sacred to us. For me, wearing my eagle feather, I don't wear it every day, obviously. I've only worn my eagle feather twice, when I got married and when I graduated from college. It's the only time. And that's the way I was taught, you know. So when somebody in their family does a great deed of graduation, and maybe some of these kids were first-time graduates in their family, that's a big deal. And that custom has been, you know, passed down for thousands of years, you know, of now you earned your eagle feather, now you earned your plume, you know, and now you graduate from high school, wear your eagle feather, your plume with pride, you know, be proud of what you did, you earned it. To me, that's the true sovereignty of our people, is when you really earn something in your education especially. So this policy has always been a big deal to me. It took time, but what we did was we took the emotion away out of it. And I can remember when the superintendent and the leaders, the powers that be said, I understand. Oh, okay, well, school board went to the school board, unanimous. Now Grand Forks did the same thing. But every May, September, when graduation starts coming around, you'll see it. You know, somebody's boycotting, somebody's in court, you know, somebody's, you know, doing something, they're mad. Not up here, you know, and these are good examples of how you can do things, you know, and passing legislation and a betterment for our kids. So I'm proud of that.
Yeah.